Hello ladies and gentlemen, once again this is Jeremy Smith. As I mentioned in my previous video, I said I was going to not make any other videos about the new Nikon Z6 and Z7 until I had a chance to have the cameras in my hands. And that moment has now happened. I just last night got a chance to have the Z7 in my hands and try out a couple of the new lenses. So I'm going to give you my first impressions. Now this is going to be a long video. There's just no making it any shorter. I've tried. So get the popcorn ready. I'm not going to do the unobstructed view of the close-up of the camera the entire time. I didn't get a chance to film as long as I would have liked to, but I'm going to show you guys different cut-ins at different points to show you close-ups of the cameras. Thanks to Bedford Camera & Video for allowing me to get my hands on this camera so that I can kind of talk about it with you. If you guys don't know, I do have an affiliate program with them which allows me to bring you guys even more videos about more cameras, and I can look at all these different cameras without having to buy them all and go bankrupt. So it works out really, really well. If you guys are interested in pre-ordering a Z6 or a Z7, or if you're interested in buying any other camera, consider Bedford Camera & Video. They're going to help you out, get the right camera. They're not going to just sell you a certain brand of camera. They're going to help you find the camera that's best for you, regardless of the brand of it. They sell many cameras. Check out the link in the description and use the GREATS as the coupon code. And yes, I'm still working on getting you guys some perks for using my code. But using that code does allow them to know that I sent you to their site, and that helps me bring you guys even more content. Okay, so with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive right in. Reading about this camera right after launch, you guys know that I made another video about this camera just before launch, and I made a few predictions. I was wrong about the adapter, first of all. I thought that Nikon would leave in the D-lens support, but they did not, as the new adapter has no focus motor. But I'll talk about the adapter a bit later on. But anyways, I said that I wouldn't make any more videos about this camera until I actually had a chance to have the camera in my hands. And now, after I've had it in my hands, I can make some more definitive sorts of statements about it. To address my somewhat clickbait title, the reason why it's in the title is because so many people have asked me this question lately. It seems like every few days more information comes out about this camera and people start clamoring about it. So yes, I did look at the camera very close, and I've determined that I don't see, unless Nikon decides to redesign the hardware, I don't see any way to use a battery grip with this camera and still have like buttons on the grip. And the reason why I say this is because there's basically two different ways that a grip can interface with the camera. You know, if you look at older Nikon cameras, like say for example, something like a Nikon D80, which let's see, I meant to grab it down from here. If you look at this camera, take off its grip. This camera has some contacts right here on the grip, and inside the battery door there's some shiny gold contacts in there that these little fingers contact, and that's what gives us all the controls and dials on the grip. Ironically enough, newer Nikon bodies, like say for example a D850, actually are very much like my Nikon F100 here, where there's a little rubber door here, and below said rubber door there are some contacts, and the grip interfaces that way. At least on the Z7, I did not see the Z6, but they should theoretically be the same since they're the same body. But on the Z7 that I handled, there is no contact on the bottom of the camera. I also looked inside the battery door. I shined a light in there. There's no contacts in there. So basically, yeah, I don't see how Nikon is going to make a grip with controls on it. So that's just something for you guys to know, because so many people have asked me about that. Now, there's been lots of controversies surrounding this camera. People talked about lack of dual card slots and just all this stuff. But I want you guys to know that whenever I went to go and look at this camera tonight, I basically put all that out of my mind, and I picked up the camera like it was completely fresh to me. And whenever I picked up the camera, I really wasn't interested in taking any photographs initially. I didn't really care about the EVF at first. I really just wanted to feel the camera. And the thing I noticed when I picked it up was that It's about the same weight as something like my Sony a7R3 or a9. The thing that's different though is that whenever you pick up one of those Sony bodies, you really kind of, they're the kind of objects that you pick up and you're like, wow, this is a little heavier than I expected it to be. And the Sony cameras just have this very dense feel. Now on paper, the Nikon and these Sony cameras weigh about the same, but the Sonys, because of their compact size, they just feel more dense and very solid. The Nikon too feels extremely solid in build quality, but it doesn't have that dense feeling because it's a little bit larger. So that was the first thing I noticed. The next thing that I noticed on the camera was, of course, the size and shape of the grip. Now, this is an interesting thing for me. I'm not going to be talking about any winners or losers here because ergonomics are such a personal thing, but here's some of my impressions. Now, on these new cameras, if I had to compare their grip to an existing camera, I would say that the cameras basically kind of remind me of something like a Nikon D5600 or perhaps even a 750. The grip feels a little bit larger than a 5600, but it doesn't feel to be as big as a 750. The grip is very, very deep. Obviously, this camera does not feel like a D5600 in terms of build quality. It definitely feels like an 850 that's just smaller. It's very solid. The 5600, of course, is plastic feeling. But when you start thinking about the size, they're very similar there. If you have small to medium or slightly large-ish hands, and you pick up one of these new bodies, first of all, if you're an existing Nikon DSLR user, you're going to be in for a treat. It's going to feel very familiar to you. A lot of people that have been using Nikon that pick up a Fuji or pick up a Sony or pick up an Olympus, I find that they're just like, oh my God, what is this thing? They feel like they're picking up something foreign and alien. So if you're a Nikon user and you pick up one of these, you're going to feel right at home. It feels just like a Nikon DSLR. The thing that does strike me a little bit is that a lot of people were expecting this D850 size mirrorless camera for some reason, and this camera is not that. It's also not a D750 size mirrorless camera either. If you have sort of like larger hands, if you have larger hands and you have very large fingers, okay, if you have sausages for fingers, seriously, and you've picked up a Sony body, you are not going to be comfortable in most cases because on Sony, of course, that mount to grip distance is so small that your fingers, with a large lens, it's not a comfortable fit. The Nikon body does not have that problem. It's there's much more space between the mount and the grip. Now, if you are kind of like me and you have kind of large-ish hands, but you don't have large fingers, you have sort of skinny fingers, or if you have fingers that are long, especially if you have fingers that are longer than mine, spoiler alert, but guess what? On these new Nikon bodies, your pinky is still going to have no love. If I kind of look at some cameras here, if I think about some other cameras that I could compare this to, I could compare it to like my A9 here, to like say a Nikon F100. Oddly enough, these new mirrorless Nikons remind me a lot of my Nikon F100, and by the way, that's a good thing. But with me, you guys will notice that when I hold this A9, of course the grip is, very, very short. It's a similar difference between this camera and the new Nikon mirrorless bodies. But whenever I go and I hold this A9, you can see that my pinky gets no love here. It will not fit on the camera. And the reason being is because my fingers are so long that I kind of have to turn my hand sideways like this. Now, if I were to hold it this way, they would all fit, but my fingers are long, so I have to kind of like put them down this way, sideways to fit, and you can see my pinky hangs off. The new Nikon mirrorless bodies are a little bit taller, but guess what? My pinky still hung off just because of my longer fingers. So I have to still I still had to turn my hand sideways, and my pinky still kind of hung off like this. I don't consider this to be a bad thing, by the way, but I'm pointing this out. So if you have, hands like I've described, you kind of know what to expect if you haven't handled this camera. Now, here's the thing that may be a little controversial to you guys, but I still prefer the ergonomics of my Sonys. I don't think that the Nikon ergonomics are bad. That is not what I'm saying. I think that the Nikon offers excellent ergonomics. If you're a Nikon DSLR user and you want something that feels similar, these bodies are going to fit your needs there. If you're the type of person that doesn't like to fiddle around with battery grips and that sort of thing, then yeah. Also, I think you're going to be very happy with these new Nikon cameras. However, I personally still like the modularity. And what I mean by that is, I think it's pretty cool to take a camera like an A9 and put a small prime on it. And if it's wintertime and I'm wearing a jacket, this is almost a pocket camera, literally. It's a pretty cool thing, in my opinion, to take a camera this size and put it in your pocket. But then, if I want to, get down to serious business and use a 70-200-2.8 or something, I can take this camera and I can put a grip on it, and then all of a sudden it looks like a big DSLR killing beast, if I want it to do that. So I feel like I have more modularity here. So I can go from a small size to a big size if I want. Also, with the smaller body, I can pack it into a bag easier than I can this Nikon. So that's my take. But both cameras are very, very good. So anyways, after a long time of just holding the camera and feeling it, and not really doing any picture taking at all, that was my impression. Feels really, really great. But Sony versus Nikon ergonomics, it can vary wildly depending on your preferences. The next thing I wanted to see though was the electronic viewfinder. Now, Nikon, they made some bold claims about this EVF. They said, hey, this is the best EVF that's ever been made and all this. And this is not sarcasm, because the EVF on these cameras is excellent. It is an excellent EVF. I remember back in the, well, I say back in the day, it wasn't that long ago, that even using cameras like Sony's a7 II, I wasn't 100% in love with the viewfinder. It was a little bit too low resolution, and the biggest problem I used to have with EVFs, or one of the biggest problems, was that I'd pick up the camera and I'd start to look through it, and if my eye wasn't just square on the viewfinder, if I was off center a little this way or a little this way, I found that I got a distorted image to the EVF just because of the way the optics work. So Nikon in their presentation, they talked heavily about the optic development in their EVF. And so the first thing I did when I picked up the camera, I put the viewfinder up to my eye. Well, after I thoroughly felt it, I put the viewfinder up to my eye and I moved the viewfinder all the way to the right, all the way to the left, and up and down. I moved it around to see if I got any distortion, and I didn't get any distortion. It was beautiful. But was it better than any of the other EVFs on the market? Was it better than like a Fuji X-H1? Was it better than a Sony A9 or an A7R III? And the answer is not really. I don't think that, if someone didn't tell me which camera I was looking through between my, A9 and this camera, I don't think I'd be able to tell the difference. But I don't consider that to be a bad thing, because all those cameras have excellent EVFs, and so does this camera. So that's my take on that. The next thing I wanted to look at on this new camera was, let's see here, I looked at a lot of things. I also wanted to look at the battery. Now, the battery on this camera is an ENL 15. It's an ENL 15B. So now we have the A in the DSLRs, we have the B in these cameras. Basically, same battery. It's still 1900 milliamp hours. The B basically means that you can USB charge it now. It's my understanding that it charges very quickly over USB-C within an hour or two. So this is all good. A lot of people have been going nuts over the battery life rating on these cameras. These cameras are not going to be any different than the Sonys, in the sense that, or should I say the latest Sonys, not the old ones. But what I mean by that is, if you're using these cameras and you're shooting in real world conditions, you're going to easily get over 1,000 shots per charge. The CPA ratings, they turn the camera on and off at certain intervals and things like that. Basically, they do a lot of things we wouldn't do in the real world. If you're going to leave your camera on and keep on shooting it, you're going to easily get over 1,000 shots per charge. Now, with that being said, I do expect a bit longer battery life out of the latest Sonys, just because of the higher rating of the battery. Nikon's ENL 15B is about 1900 milliamp hours, I said. The Sony Z-Type battery is 2,280 milliamp hours, so it's slightly higher capacity, a little bit better battery life. Really not a big deal. They're both going to be really, really good. all the Nikon DSLR users that are obviously have never used a mirrorless camera, please calm down. It's going to be okay. In the real world, you're easily going to get over 1,000 shots per charge. It's not a big deal. It's going to be excellent. It's going to be way better than like the A7R II. And heck, it's going to be, well, it's still going to be way better than any of Fuji's current cameras. So I wouldn't sweat it at all at this point. The next thing that I looked at on the camera, I wanted to go into detail about the focus system, but frankly, that's one of those things. I went in there thinking, if the focus system, if I can really quantify the differences in focus system right now, then I'm going to make a video and I'm going to talk about it. But if I can't quantify any major differences and I feel like I need more time, I'm just not going to talk about the focus system. And so basically that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to fall into that latter category. There wasn't enough time for me to really test this properly. A bunch of YouTubers I feel like have jumped the gun in testing the AF on this camera. These are technically cameras. I don't feel like the hardware is going to really change on these cameras, but I'm going to give Nikon the benefit of the doubt because these cameras do have, early firmware. I know personally that I saw tons of improvements on the Sony A9 from the early days to the final release and so on. So I'm going to give Nikon the same courtesy, and I'm going to wait to test the autofocus until I have an actual production camera in my hands. But my initial testing with it looked pretty good. The other reason why I'd really like to reserve judgment on focus is because I only tested the 24-70 f4 and the 35 1.8. I would have loved to test the 50 1.8, because I would have liked to actually challenge it with some shallower depth of field. You can't really do that with the 24-70 f4. You can't really do that with the 35 1.8. So that's another reason why I'm going to skip that for now. But my initial impression was good. And speaking of those lenses, there's a lot of stuff online going around where people are saying, well, those lenses are glorified kit lenses. And there's so many people that have not touched these lenses, but they keep trashing them, saying they're kit lenses, saying they're junk and so on. Now, I can't say much about the optical performance of these lenses yet. The few brief shots I took, I took a couple shots wide open at 1.8. I think Nikon's so mad at me, guys, for my whole Nikon switchover or Sony switchover video, because they didn't let me keep any of the images. But basically, the images I did look at on the back of the camera, they were very sharp. I used the 35 1.8 wide open and I was impressed, but obviously it's going to take more time to test those. But no, those lenses do not feel like crap. They feel very solid to me. They don't feel like kit lenses. They do have a sill at the mount. And they feel very solid. Yes, they look very minimalistic in design, but so do lenses like my 35 2.8 that I'm filming this video with right now, and so does my 55 1.8. It's a very similar lens to those Sony lenses if you've ever felt those, except these lenses actually have some weather sealing. So I have nothing bad to say, and I need more time to test those. The mount itself is something that I'm pretty excited about. Now, this is an area where, honestly, for months, I was waiting to see what Nikon was going to do. Back in the day, back almost before I was born, Nikon and Canon, were competing. Well, they're still competing, but Canon completely changed their lens mount whenever they went to the EOS system. They went to EF lenses. And a lot of people were very, very, very upset by that. And, Sony, whenever they went to E-mount, once they started seeing E-mount develop more and more of their users being more interested in that, they've pretty much gone over just about fully to E-mount at this point. Now, here's the thing. In order for me to be fair and objective, I'm going to address two different sides of this coin. There's been lots of Sony users that have said, hey, well, Nikon, they're 2 years behind. And actually lots of mirrorless users have been saying this, but Sony users especially, they've said, hey, Nikon is too, they're way behind. It's too late for Nikon to get into mirrorless. They've said that if Nikon were really serious about mirrorless, they would just completely go all in on mirrorless, and they wouldn't be scared to cannibalize the sales of the D850. They've been saying all these things. And they've been comparing to Sony, saying, well, Sony, they just about completely ditched the A mount and jumped to E mount. And they've been making that comparison. And that's really not a fair comparison. Nikon has a much larger user base of F mount users to consider. Sony, frankly, whenever Sony went over to E mount, the truth is they were not setting the world on fire with their DSLRs. And whenever they started developing E-mount and it became successful, and they jumped over and started putting more development dollars into E-mounts, they had nothing to lose. So comparing them to Nikon is not really fair. But it's also not fair to make this other comparison that I hear Nikon users making, where they're saying, well, you know, these Nikon mirrorless cameras are way better than anything Sony ever had. Well, actually, they've been saying these Nikon mirrorless cameras are way better than Sony's first mirrorless cameras. That's not a fair comparison either, guys, because whenever Sony first came out with full-frame mirrorless wasn't a thing at all. Sony kind of invented full-frame mirrorless. So Sony is a massive electronics company. You can love that fact, you can hate that fact, but it's true. And Sony, they felt a lot safer making some really big gambles early on with their camera system. And those gambles turned out to pay off for the most part. So whenever we look at their first mirrorless cameras, those cameras were not designed to be DSLR killers. So saying that the latest Nikon mirrorless are better than those is not a fair comparison because those cameras were made with two different intentions. So I just wanted to kind of clear that out. You know, I wanted to get that out of the way. Both those are not fair. But the good news is, with Nikon going where they are now, you know, they've let Sony do all the R&D in full-frame mirrorless, and they're basically just kind of, you know, adding their own flavor. They're adding a larger grip and ergonomics that they feel that their users are going to like better. They're adding, you know, lenses that they feel that their users are going to like better. I mean, this is all good for all of us. We're all going to win because we have this very diverse field in full-frame mirrorless cameras now. So this is a good thing. Nikon's larger mount facilitates faster lenses. That's one big thing that I like about it. You know, Nikon, they have their legendary 58mm 1.2, which is a manual focus f-mount lens that sells for ridiculous prices right now on eBay used. And then they have the modern day 58mm 1.4. Now, they couldn't make that 1.4 a 1.2 because in order to have space for the AF contacts, they couldn't get the rear element any larger with the f-mount, so they had to sacrifice. And in order to make it autofocus, it had to be a 1.4. So this larger mount is allowing for newer lenses like the 58mm 0.95, which ironically is going to be a manual focus lens. But also on Nikon's roadmap for, I believe, 2019, they have a lens that is a 50mm 1.2 that is autofocus. So this new mount is going to facilitate some new lens development. That's very exciting. The other thing that this lens mount should allow for is better designed ultra-wide angle lenses, because basically whenever you have these ultra-wides, they benefit from having light strike the sensor as head-on as possible. And so with this larger mount, they should have more freedom in designing these lenses to where they can get them to direct the light at a much tighter angle and not at such extreme angles. That should mean better edge sharpness, it should mean less vignetting, and so on. So these are all good things. Now, the last thing about Nikon's new mount that they've been talking about, guys, I'm not an optical engineer. I'm not going to pretend like I am, but I have some questions about it. I just don't have enough information. But there's been a lot of talk about these new lenses, like say for example the 35-1.8 or the 50-1.8. They've been saying that those lenses are going to perform more like a 50-1.4. They're saying that their 24-70 f4 is going to perform more like an f2.8 because of the larger mount. Now, once again, guys, not an engineer, but as far as I can tell, there's two things that affect how much light gets through a lens and hits your sensor. One of those is the f-stop. F-stop is just a ratio between the focal length of the lens and the actual physical lens diaphragm opening inside the lens. And the other thing is the so-called T-stop, the transmission. You know, every time you have a lens, of course lenses are comprised of multiple elements, every time light passes through another glass surface, some of that light is lost. So, you know, we think about it being like this laser point line where all the light's coming through, but really every time the light hits one of those glass surfaces, some of it kind of scatters out. And because of that, not all of it reaches the image sensor. So this is why if you look at a lens like, say for example, Sigma's 51.4 Art Series lens, excellent lens, one of my favorites. But that lens is an f1.8 lens, but it's transmission value, how much light actually gets to the lens and hits the sensor, is actually a t-stop, which is a transmission value. It's a t-stop of f1.8, not 1.4, because some of that light is lost in the process. So I know I've gone a little nerdy now, but going back to Nikon's mount, I don't understand how a mount would facilitate more light getting to the sensor. As far as I can tell, that's only going to be affected by f-stop and the transmission value, the t-stop. The only thing that kind of makes sense to me, and I've been thinking about this a lot, the only thing that kind of makes sense is maybe they're thinking that it's gonna, that a 1.8 lens is gonna have a t-stop that's more like 1.4. And frankly, guys, I think that's a bit of a stretch, but I'm gonna kind of give Nikon the benefit of the doubt. Maybe because of the larger mounts, they're saying that they're able to have less glass elements, and perhaps less glass elements mean that the t-stop value is higher because, you're going to have less light losses because the light's not going to have to go through as many glass elements. So maybe that's what they're saying. I mean, I have no idea. I'm not aware of any lens that has a t-stop greater than its f-stop though, so I'm not really sure how that works. Anyways, I'm giving Nikon a lot of the benefit of the doubt here, but I don't see how this whole larger mount thing is going to make a 1.8 lens perform like a 1.4 or f4 perform like a 2.8. I'm obviously going to be testing that, and even though I'm not an optical engineer, I'm going to be talking to some optical engineers that I do know, and we're going to have a long discussion about this, but right now, we're going to put an asterisk by that one. Anyways, that's the main things that I tested on the camera so far. I'm going to put some other links in the description. Let me make sure that I haven't forgotten anything, because I'm doing this video in one take. It is not going to get redone. Oh yes, one last thing that I want to talk about. This is really the only aspect of shooting that I was really able to sufficiently test to my liking. And that is the whole continuous shooting. Now, if you guys know me, you know that I'm a portrait photographer. And I guess speaking of portrait photography, this camera does have face detect, by the way. I didn't get a chance to test that. Now, it does not have eye detect like Sony. But as far as I'm concerned, only Sony has eye detect like Sony. So if you're looking for that, you're not going to find it. However, on these new cameras, the focus precision seems to be very high in my initial testing, but we'd expect that from a mirrorless body. Nikon seems to have done pretty well with that. But once again, when I get a production camera in my hands, I'm going to go into more focusing testing. The one thing I did test though, shooting wise, was the continuous burst. Now, as a portrait photographer, I don't care anything about continuous shooting. If Sony or Fuji or Panasonic or Nikon came out with the camera and said, hey, this is our new awesome 50 megapixel beast of a camera that costs $1,500. Oh, but by the way, Jeremy, it only shoots 3 frames a second. I would still say, cool, sign me up for it. I don't care about speed, but I know a lot of you do care about speed. So one thing that was unknown was how this camera actually handled continuous shooting. In the continuous shooting, the Z7 is rated at, I believe, 11 frames per second. But people were saying, hey, if you're shooting in a certain mode, it does 11 frames a second. But if you are just shooting in the regular continuous shooting, you can only do up to 5.5. And, I was getting a lot of conflicting reports about this. Some people said that you needed a battery grip to get the 11 frames a second. Some people said that, the camera wouldn't autofocus if you were at the 11 frames a second. I mean, there was all these different things. But what I discovered is that in order to get the 11 frames a second, you have to go into this higher shooting. I think it's called like high speed plus mode or something like that Nikon called it. And that gives you the 11 frames a second. What it does is it locks the exposure on the first shots, and in the following shots, the exposure doesn't change. So if you're shooting in manual, like if your ISO is on, if you set it to something manually and you set your shutter speed and your aperture, this doesn't affect you. However, if you were shooting in manual and your ISO was on automatic, or if you were shooting in program or another priority mode where the camera is going to have control of the exposure, this would affect you, because what's going to happen is your camera is going to lock the exposure on the first shot, and as you keep on shooting, you're going to be at that same exposure. So I gave this a little bit of a test. I set the camera to the regular continuous shooting speed, and I basically started, I don't remember what mode I was in. You guys will see it in the video I'm about to play, but you will notice that the settings are changing. I basically started at the dark parts at the floor and I kind of kept shooting and I moved the camera up and you'll see the exposure change throughout those shots. But then I put it into this high-speed plus mode and there you'll notice that the exposure did not change from the first shot. So that is, as far as I can tell, true, unless Nikon decides to change this in the final firmware. That is a really big downside if you're doing a lot of action. So for most people, you know, unless you're just shooting full manual all the time, this camera is effectively 5.5 frames a second and not 11. So
Anytime trying to figure out what y'all were doing?
One of our guys knows one of the guys testing or something like that. Yeah, I'm hoping we have the bigger one.
And as far as I can tell, even though I didn't test the Z6, the Z6 apparently does the same thing as the Z7 in this regard. So that's just something to keep in mind. Let's see, I think, oh my goodness, I think that's about it. I'm going to give you guys some final thoughts here. You know, I was a Nikon user for a very, very long period of time. And as many of you know, I fully switched over to Sony. I used Nikon and Sony cameras side by side for at least 5 years, if not a bit longer, before finally deciding to fully go to Sony. Now, this doesn't mean that I think that Nikon cameras aren't good. However, I will say that if these cameras existed back whenever I made my switch fully over to Sony, I still would have gone to Sony. The reason why, and this is all to do with different user preferences. I feel like that's the problem right now. A lot of people are giving these cameras a lot of negative feedback right now. They're doing this because they really feel like, you know, they've been cheated by Nikon somehow. I don't know why. I mean, it's clearly emotional. It's an emotional sort of thing that they're experiencing. I don't take any pity in that. But did I say pity? What? No. I don't take any. I don't gloat in that. It's what I meant to say. But basically, the reason why I think these people are very, very, you know, emotional about this is because they feel like Nikon has come out with a camera that doesn't meet their needs. And the thing about this is, you know, for me, instead of like looking at these cameras and saying, well, you know, they have one card slot, so they suck, you know, I'm looking at these cameras objectively. Now, for me personally, 2 card slots is something that I require because of my workflow and my preferences. Back whenever I was looking at the A7R II, I refused to go to that camera because of 1 card slot. So basically nothing has changed here. I'm going to give you a couple thoughts about this. Number one, when we look at all these different cameras, just because they don't meet our needs doesn't mean that they automatically are terrible. I feel like Nikon had a very tough decision to make. If Nikon came out with a very high-end A9 killing Nikon mirrorless body, they still wouldn't have been able to be successful, I don't feel, because number one, they would have a very awesome camera with no lenses at this point, and also they would have ticked off their existing user base. Yes, you can adapt the lenses, and by the way, I did adapt a Nikon 70-200, the latest FL version, and I was impressed with the performance. I'm not a fan of adapting lenses on any mirrorless system, and Nikon is no exception there. But if you do have a lot of Nikon lenses, you will still get usable performance out of your f-mount glass on these cameras. But anyways, looking at these cameras, the big thing that I noticed is that, you know, for me, I wanted a system that was going to replace my DSLRs. And Nikon, had they done an A9 level camera, they wouldn't have had any glass for it. They wouldn't have had the user base for it. I feel like a lot of existing DSLR users would have been pretty upset at Nikon if they came out with something that immediately obsoleted their D5. So right now, I think Nikon had no choice but play it safe. They needed to release a solid mirrorless camera that was competitive in the market while still catering to their existing users. And I think that they've achieved that goal. Now, when we get to the next generation of camera, I think that's when we're going to actually see this really, really big change and evolution in Nikon mirrorless cameras, especially once we get to about 2020 when there's more lenses available and so on. If you are an existing Nikon user and you're not like me and you don't intend to replace your DSLRs with the mirrorless system, you want a good mirrorless body or bodies to go with your existing DSLRs, I think these cameras have your name written on them, especially if you're a wildlife photographer, because you know, a lot of people have complained about Sony weather sealing, and I think it's a legitimate concern for a lot of people. It's not a concern for me. If it's raining outside, I'm gonna be in my studio shooting with the camera in one hand and a latte in the other. Yeah, I'm that guy. Seriously, I'm not an outdoorsman. So for me, it's not a concern, but if you are an outdoorsy kind of photographer, these cameras make a lot of sense. If you've got Nikon glass, even more sense. You know, you can adapt these lenses, your F-mount lenses to this camera and have very good performance there. And a lot of people don't realize that Nikon is not, I don't think Nikon is going for the mass market with these cameras. I think they're trying to meet their existing user base. But I've talked about this long enough. Write me in the comments below, let me know what you think. I know this video has been long. I'm gonna be answering more questions if you have them, so just write the comments. And I'll probably reply to a lot of them right now. And I'll probably be releasing perhaps another video where I show more close-ups of the camera because I shot lots of footage. I'm not sure that all of it will make it into this video. As always, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, this is Jeremy Smith, signing off.